listening difficulty. Figure 5:16. The orchestral score of the beginning of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5, first page, with instruments listed. Listening exercise 8. Hearing the instruments of the orchestra identifying a single instrument. 17. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your text website. By listening to the intro CD, tracks 13 to 16, you have heard all of the instructor. Go to the principal instruments of the Western Symphony Orchestra. Now it is time to test your ability to identify these instruments. The intro CD, track 17, contains excerpts of performances of 10 solo instruments. Write the name of the correct instrument in the blank by choosing one from the right-hand column. 1. Clarinet 2. Oboe 3. Tuba 4. Bassoon 5. Violin 6. French horn 7. Flute 8. Cello 9. Double bass 10. Trombone. Listening exercise 9. Hearing the instruments of the orchestra identifying 2 instruments. Now things get more difficult. Can you identify 2 instruments playing at once, and which one is playing in a higher range? To keep you on track, a few instruments have been filled in. Choose from among the following instruments for the remaining blanks below: violin, viola, cello, double bass, flute, clarinet, oboe, bassoon, trumpet, and French horn. 18. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Listening exercise 10. Hearing the instruments of the orchestra identifying 3 instruments. Ready for the ultimate test. Now you need to identify 3 instruments. Choose from among the following instruments for the blanks below: violin, viola, cello, flute, clarinet, bassoon, trumpet, trombone, French horn, and tuba. 19. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Finally, identify the highest and lowest sounding of the 3 instruments in 4 of the excerpts. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lectures at OpenYale courses and complete this chapter's listening exercises interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: dynamics, forte, piano, sforzando, crescendo. Decrescendo, color, timbre, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, chorus, mezzo, soprano, baritone, overtone, vibrato, pizzicato, tremolo, trill, mute, glissando, mouthpiece, stop. Orchestral score. 6. Musical texture and form. When a painter or weaver arranges material on a canvas or loom, he or she creates a texture. Texture is the density and arrangement of artistic elements. Look at Vincent van Gogh's branch of an almond tree in blossom, shown in Figure 6.1. Though heavier at the bottom, the texture is generally light and airy, owing to the spaces between the lines. And because the curving horizontal and vertical lines are more or less equally distributed across the blue background, the canvas conveys a feeling of balance and repose. Just as a painter can fabricate a particular texture, dense, heavy, light, or thin, with independent or interdependent strands, so, too, can the composer create similar effects with musical lines. The opening section of Richard Strauss's Thus Spoke Zarathustra begins with the bottom range of the orchestral palette in a sparse texture, then fills in the middle and upper range sounds, and concludes with the densest orchestral texture, all the instruments of the great 19th century orchestra filling in the full sonic spectrum. Monophonic, homophonic, and polyphonic textures. There are 3 primary textures in music: monophonic, homophonic, and polyphonic, depending on the number of musical lines and the way they relate to one another. Often we call these lines, or parts, voices even though they might not actually be sung. Monophony is the easiest texture to hear. As the name one sounding indicates, monophony is a single line of music, with no harmony. When you sing by yourself, you are creating monophonic music. When a group of men sing the same pitches together, they are singing in unison. Unison singing is monophonic singing. Even when men and women sing together, doubling pitches at the octave, the texture is still monophonic. Thus, when we sing "Happy Birthday" with our friends at a party, and we all sing the exact same notes at the same time, we are singing in monophony. Monophonic texture is the sparsest of all musical textures. Homophony means same sounding. In this texture the voices, or lines, all move together to new pitches at roughly the same time. The most common type of homophonic texture is tune plus chordal accompaniment. Here a melody is supported by the blocks of sound called chords. Notice in example 6:1 how the melody, which by itself would be monophonic, now joins with vertical blocks of chords to create homophonic texture. Holiday carols, hymns, folk songs, and almost all pop songs invariably have this sort of tune plus chordal accompaniment texture when sung with harmony. Can you hear in your mind's ear a band playing the Star-Spangled Banner? That's homophonic texture. Figure 6:1. Branch of an Almond Tree in Blossom by Vincent van Gogh. Copyright Art Resource, New York. Example 6:1 Homophony. As might be supposed from the meaning of its name, many-sounding, polyphony requires two or more lines in the musical fabric. In addition, the term polyphonic implies that each of the lines will be autonomous and independent, often entering at different times. Thus polyphonic texture has a strong linear thrust, whereas in homophonic texture the fabric is marked by lines that are more vertically conceived as blocks of accompanying chords. In polyphonic texture the voices are of equal importance, moving against one another to create what is called counterpoint. Counterpoint is simply the harmonious opposition of two or more independent musical lines. Because counterpoint requires polyphonic texture, the terms counterpoint and polyphony are often used interchangeably. Finally, there are two types of counterpoint, free and imitative. In free counterpoint the voices are highly independent, they may begin all together or begin separately, but they then go their own ways. Much jazz improvisation is done in free counterpoint. To hear a fine example, turn to the end of Louis Armstrong's rendition of Willie the Weeper. In imitative counterpoint, on the other hand, a leading voice begins followed by one or more other voices that duplicate what the first voice presented. If the followers copy exactly, note for note, what the leader plays or sings, then a canon results. Think of Three Blind Mice, Are You Sleeping, and Row, Row, Row Your Boat, and remember how each voice enters in turn, imitating the first voice from beginning to end. These are all short canons, or rounds, a type of strictly imitative counterpoint popular since the Middle Ages. Example 6:2 shows the beginning of a brief canon for three voices. Example 6:2 Polyphony. Among the most famous canons in music is Johann Pachelbel's canon in D major, written in Germany about 1690. This is not a short round like, Are You Sleeping, but a lengthy work in which one violin begins and then two others in turn duplicate this line, note after note, for more than 4 minutes. As we saw in listening exercise 7, in Pachelbel's canon a repeating bass line supports the three canonic upper parts, the bass sounds forth during the first two measures, and then the canon begins. Example 6:3 Pachelbel's canon. Of course, composers are not limited to just one of these three musical textures, they can switch them within a given work. To get the sound of the various textures in your ear, as well as to hear changes of texture, listen to the famous Hallelujah chorus from George Friedrich Handel's Messiah. Notice how rapidly, yet smoothly, the composer moves back and forth among homophonic, monophonic, and polyphonic textures. Listening exercise 11. Hearing musical textures. 21. On your intro CD, track 21, you have 10 excerpts that exemplify the three basic textures of music. Monophonic texture, you will find, is easy to hear because it has only one line of music. More difficult is differentiating homophonic texture and polyphonic texture. Homophonic texture usually uses blocks of chords that accompany and support a single melody. Polyphonic texture, on the other hand, embodies many active, independent lines. Identify the texture of each of the excerpts by writing an M, H, or P in the appropriate blank. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. 1. Bach, Contrapunctus 9 from the Art of Fugue 2. Beethoven, Symphony No. 5, First Movement. 3. Mussorgsky, Promenade from Pictures at an Exhibition 4. Mussorgsky, Promenade from Pictures at an Exhibition 5. Bach, Organ Fugue in G minor. 6. Debussy, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun 7. Josquin des Prés, Ave Maria. 8. Dvorak, Symphony No. 9, from the New World, Second Movement 9. Louis Armstrong, Willie the Weeper. 10. Copeland, A Gift to Be Simple, from Appalachian Spring. Form. Form in music is the arrangement of musical events. In architecture, sculpture, and painting, objects are situated in physical space so as to impose a formal design. Similarly, in music a composer places important sonic events in an order that creates a pleasing shape as sounds pass by in time. To create form in music, a composer can employ four processes: statement, repetition, contrast, and variation. In other words, important musical ideas are stated, repeated, contrasted, or varied. A statement, of course, is the presentation of an important musical idea. Repetition works in tandem with a statement; it validates the statement by repeating it. Nothing would be more bewildering for a listener than a steady stream of ever-new music. How would we make sense of it? Repetition of a melody sets forth the formal markers, declaring each return an important musical event. Repetition also conveys a sense of comfort and security, of the musically familiar. Contrast, on the other hand, takes us away from the familiar and into the unknown. A quiet melody in the strings can suddenly be followed by an insistent theme blasting from the French horns, as happens, for example, in the third movement of Beethoven's well-known Symphony No. 5. Contrasting melodies, rhythms, textures, and moods can be used to serve as a foil to familiar material, to provide variety, and even to create conflict. In music, as in life, we need security, but we also need novelty and excitement, thus the interplay between repeating and contrasting musical units. Variation stands midway between repetition and contrast. The original melody returns but is altered in some way. For example, the tune may now be more complex, or new instruments may be added against it to create counterpoint. The listener has the satisfaction of hearing the familiar melody, yet is challenged to recognize in what way it has been changed. Needless to say, memory plays an important role in allowing us to hear musical form. Music is a most unusual art; we can't see it or touch it. As it wafts through the air, we use memory to make sense of it. We live forward but understand backward. Whether in history or in music, our memory puts the pieces together to show us relationships, patterns, and forms. To help in this process, musicians have developed a simple system to visualize forms by labeling musical units with letters. The first statement of a musical idea is designated A. Subsequent contrasting sections are labeled B, C, D, and so on. If the first or any other musical unit returns in varied form, then that variation is indicated by a superscript number, A and B, for example. Subdivisions of each large musical unit are shown by lowercase letters. How this works will become clear in the examples used throughout this book. 5 favorite musical forms. Most musical forms are timeless; they are not unique to any one period in the history of music. The 5 forms discussed below have been favored by composers of both popular and classical music for many hundreds of years. Strophic form. This is the most familiar of all musical forms because our hymns, carols, folk songs, patriotic songs, and pop tunes invariably make use of it. In strophic form, the composer sets the words of the first poetic stanza and then uses the same entire melody for all subsequent stanzas. A good example is the 1960s pop favorite The Wait, originally created by the Canadian-American group The Band and then covered by at least 30 other artists, including the alternative rock group Travis. As is typical of many pop songs, each strophe begins with a verse of text and ends with a chorus, a textual refrain that repeats. Below is the text for the first 2 strophes of this 5-strophe song. Again, in strophic form, each strophe has the same music. Text not available due to copyright restrictions. Now listen to the first 2 stanzas of the equally well-known Wiegenlied of Johannes Brahms. Each stanza, again, is sung to the same music, but there is no chorus. Hear the band sing this song in strophic form in the YouTube playlist on the text website. A slightly varied version of strophic form, modified strophic form, can be heard in Clara Schumann's Liebst du am Schönheit, 23. Theme and variations. If, in the preceding example, the music of the first strophe, or stanza, is altered in some way each time it returns, then theme and variations form is present. The sort of changes that might occur include additions to the melody, new chords in the supporting accompaniment, and more density in the texture. The return of the basic musical unit provides a unifying element, while the changes add variety. Theme and variations form can be visualized in the following scheme. Figure 6.2. Henri Matisse's Jeanette 1.5 provides a clear example of theme and variations form applied to sculpture. Matisse first creates a sculpture of the head of his servant Jeanette and then offers 4 progressively more abstract variations of it. Digital image. The Museum of Modern Art, licensed by Scala Art Resource, New York. When Mozart was a young man, he lived briefly in Paris, where he heard the French folk song Ah, vous dirais maman. We know it today as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Upon this charming tune he later composed a set of variations for piano, the first 3 of which are described in the following listening guide. Figure 6.3. The essence of binary form, or AB form, can be seen in this Japanese wood carving. Here the 2 figures are distinctly different, yet mutually harmonious. Ternary form, or ABA form, can clearly be seen in the architecture of the Cathedral of Salzburg, Austria, where Mozart and his father frequently performed. Digital image. 2009 Museum Associates, LACMA Art Resource, New York. Richard Clune Corbis. Binary form. As the name indicates, binary form consists of 2 contrasting units, A and B. In length and general shape, A and B are constructed so as to balance and complement each other. Variety is usually introduced in B by means of a dissimilar mood, key, or melody. Sometimes in binary form, both A and B are immediately repeated, note for note. Musicians indicate exact repeats by means of the following sign, thus, when binary form appears as AB it is performed AABB. Joseph Haydn created a perfect example of binary form in music for the second movement of his Symphony No. 94. Here an 8-bar musical phrase is balanced by a different but corresponding 8-bar phrase. First A and then B are repeated. Notice that the repeats involve slight alterations. In the repeat of A, Haydn adds a sudden sforzando to startle sleepy listeners. From this musical gesture the symphony derives its name, the Surprise Symphony. In the repeat of B, flutes are added to the melody to enrich it. Ternary form. Ternary form in music is even more common than binary. It consists of 3 sections. The second is a contrasting unit, and the third is a repeat of the first, hence the formal pattern is ABA. As we will see, ternary form has appeared many times in the history of music. It is an especially satisfying arrangement because it is simple yet rounded and complete. Listen now to the Dance of the Reed Pipes from Peter Tchaikovsky's famous ballet The Nutcracker. The A section is bright and cheery because it makes use of the major mode as well as silvery flutes. However, B is dark and low, even ominous, owing to the minor mode and the insistent ostinato in the bass. The return of A is shortened because the melody is not repeated. Rondo form. Rondo form involves a simple principle: a refrain alternates with contrasting music. Usually in a rondo, there are at least 2 contrasting sections. Perhaps because of its simple, but pleasing design, rondo form has been favored by musicians of every age, medieval monks, classical symphonists such as Mozart and Haydn, and even contemporary pop artists like Sting. Although the principle of a recurring refrain is a constant, composers have written rondos in several different formal patterns, as seen below. The hallmark of each, however, is a refrain. Abaca, abacaba, abacada. Figure 6.4. The Château of Chambord, France, has a formal design equivalent to abacaba structure, a pattern often encountered in music in rondo form. Charles and Josette Lieners Corbis. You may already be familiar with a rondo composed by Jean-Joseph Mouret, made famous as the theme music for Masterpiece Theater, America's longest-running primetime drama series, on PBS. Mouret was a composer at the French court during the reign of Louis XV, and his well-known rondo typifies the ceremonial splendor of the royal household during the Baroque era. Here the refrain, played by full orchestra with brilliant trumpets and drums, alternates with 2 contrasting ideas to form a neatly symmetrical pattern. To sum up, form in music is the purposeful arrangement of important musical elements. It offers a user-friendly guide, a roadmap, if you will, to the passage of music through time. Strophic form involves the repetition of the same short piece again and again, each time with a new text. In theme and variations form, a single idea continually returns but is varied in each presentation. Binary form involves 2 contrasting sections, whereas ternary form calls for statement, contrast, and return. Finally, in rondo form a predominant theme returns at regular intervals. These 5 forms are basic to all kinds of music in many parts of the world. In Western classical music there are other, more complex forms, such as sonata, allegro, and fugal form. These we will meet in the subsequent parts of this book. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: texture, monophony, unison, homophony, polyphony, counterpoint, canon, form, statement, repetition, contrast, variation, strophic form, chorus. Theme and variations, binary form. Ternary form, rondo form. Musical style 7. One of the challenges of listening to music is evaluating what we hear. Consciously or not, we do this every day. For example, sometimes when turning on the car radio or flipping through a playlist, we land in the middle of an unrecognized piece. Immediately, we try to make an educated guess as to the style. If pop, is it rap or reggae? If classical, is it romantic or baroque? As to the composer or artist, is the style that of Bach, Beethoven, or Bono? But what is style generally in music, and what is style specifically in classical music? Style in music generally is the distinctive sound created by an artist, composer, or performing group. The voice of Norah Jones, for example, has a distinctive style that is soft and velvety. Classical composers, too, have distinctive styles. Take a work by Mozart. For example, a trained listener will recognize it as a piece from the classical period because of its generally symmetrical melodies, light texture, and dynamic ebb and flow. A truly experienced ear will identify Mozart as the composer, perhaps by recognizing the sudden shifts to minor keys, the intensely chromatic melodies, or the colorful writing for the woodwinds, all hallmarks of Mozart's personal musical style. Classical music in general, and indeed each period in its history, also has a distinctive style. Here style is determined by the particular presentation and arrangement of the basic elements of music, rhythm, melody, harmony, texture, and so on. A concerto from the Baroque era, for example, will likely be marked by a strong bass, direct chord progressions, and an energetic but repetitive rhythm. A symphony from the Romantic period, on the other hand, will typically exhibit long, sweeping melodies, chromatic harmonies, and a relaxed, free rhythm. Every musical era has such telltale markers of style. Human activity, artistic or otherwise, cannot always be neatly categorized. When does an infant become a child, or the child the adult? Similarly, musical styles do not change overnight, they evolve and overlap. Historians of music, however, like historians of art, have divided the development of Western music into 8 style periods. This allows us to break the long continuum of human creativity into shorter, more manageable units. Figure 7, 1. Portions of the East Wing of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, built in 1978 to a design by I. M. Pei, stand in contrast to the United States Capitol in the background. Pei's building, with its flat surfaces and unadorned geometric shapes, is representative of the modern style in architecture, while the Capitol reflects the neoclassical style of the 18th century. Arcade Alamy. Complete checklists of musical style can be found at the text website. Middle Ages, 476, 1450 Classical, 1750, 1820. Modern, 1900, 1985 Renaissance, 1450, 1600 Romantic, 1820, 1900. Postmodern, 1945, present Baroque, 1600, 1750. Impressionist, 1880, 1920. View and hear comparisons of and quizzes on musical styles of all periods in the history of music, at the text website. Key word: style. Part 2. The Middle Ages I and Renaissance, 476, 1600. British Library Board. All rights reserved. The Bridgeman Art Library International 8 Medieval Music, 476, 1459 Renaissance Music, 1450, 1600. Historians use the term Middle Ages as a catch-all phrase to refer to the 1,000 years of history between the fall of the Roman Empire and the dawn of the Age of Discovery. It was a period of monks and nuns, of knightly chivalry and brutal warfare, of sublime spirituality and deadly plagues, and of soaring cathedrals amidst abject poverty. Two institutions vied for political control, the church and the court. From our modern perspective, the medieval period appears as a vast chronological expanse dotted by outposts of dazzling architecture, stunning stained glass, and equally compelling poetry and music. Renaissance means literally rebirth. Historians use the term to designate a period of intellectual and artistic flowering that occurred first in Italy, then in France, and finally in England, during the years 1350 to 1600. Music historians apply the term more narrowly to musical developments in those same countries during the period 1450 to 1600. The Renaissance was an age in which writers, artists, and architects looked back to classical Greece and Rome to find models for personal and civic expression. It was an important period for music as well. Among the most significant musical developments of the Renaissance was a newfound desire to use music to amplify the meaning of a given text. Finally, attributing creativity to human accomplishment as well as to God, Renaissance composers began to fashion secular music for the home as well as traditional religious music for the church. 8. Medieval music, 476-1450. Music in the monastery. Pop musicians around the world today have no use for musical notation. Instead, they pass along tunes orally, one singer, or group, hears and copies another. Music is not fixed on paper in quarter notes and meter signatures but is captured in digital recordings, whether MP3 files or discs. So, too, in the Middle Ages, one soldier, farmer, weaver, or minstrel heard a tune and passed it on. Needless to say, there were no digital recordings in the Middle Ages. What's more, there was little musical notation. Most music was not written down in a formal language of notation symbols. Why would anyone want to write down sounds? Sometime before the year 1000 CE, however, a few influential monks of the Western Church determined that they needed a way to organize, speak about, teach, and send to fellow monks and nuns the vast body of chant that they had learned by ear and had been singing in their churches. Slowly, they developed a system whereby dashes and dots, called noti in Latin, could be set on parchment to indicate the upward and downward motion of a melody. But exactly how far up or down did the pitch go? To represent melodic distance, these notational symbols were put on a grid of lines and spaces that were identified by letter names. Thus emerged the essence of the musical notation we now use for Western classical music. But medieval notation was for a select few, an educated class, because in the Middle Ages only the men, and to a lesser degree the nuns, of the church were educated. Notation was a semi-secret language used by those initiated into the ways of the Christian church, who lived and worked in monasteries and convents. Gregorian chant. Life in a medieval monastery or convent was not easy. Monks and nuns generally had to rise at 4 o'clock in the morning to attend the first religious service of the day, called matins. Here the clergy read scripture, prayed, and sang, and so, too, at 8 other observances throughout the day. The most important service was Mass, celebrated about 9 o'clock in the morning, which commemorated in word and song Christ's suffering on the cross. The music heard at all medieval churches was what we today call Gregorian chant, named in honor of Pope Gregory the Great. Ironically, Gregory wrote little, if any, of this music. Being more a church administrator than a musician, he merely decreed that certain chants should be sung on certain days of the liturgical year. Melodies for the Christian service had, of course, existed since the time of Christ's apostles. In truth, what we now call Gregorian chant is really a large body of unaccompanied vocal music, setting sacred Latin texts, written for the Western Church over the course of 15 centuries, from roughly the time of Christ to the Council of Trent, which brought sweeping changes to the Church of Rome. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 15, Benedictine Chant and Music in the Sistine Chapel, at the text website. Gregorian chant is like no other music. It has a timeless, otherworldly quality that arises, no doubt, because Gregorian chant has neither meter nor regular rhythms. True, some notes are longer or shorter than others, but they do not recur in obvious patterns that would allow us to clap our hands or tap our feet. Free of tension and drama, chant is far more conducive to pious meditation than to dancing. Because all voices sing in unison, Gregorian chant is considered monophony, or music for one line. There is no instrumental accompaniment, nor, as a rule, are men's and women's voices mixed. Finally, Gregorian chant has a uniform, monochromatic sound. Any contrasts that occur are of the mildest sort. Sometimes a soloist will alternate with a full choir, for example. Occasionally, a passage of syllabic singing will give way to melismatic singing, as in example 8:1. Download supplementary listening guides for 3 more chants, dies irae, puer natus est nobis, and vitamus stellum, at the text website. Example 8:1 shows most of a lengthy chant, Vidrunt omnes, sung during Mass on Christmas Day. We know that it dates from the 5th century CE, but we know nothing about its creator. Notice that although the pitches are clearly indicated, no rhythmic information is provided. The notes are generally of one basic value, something close to our 8th note in length. Notice also the presence of syllabic singing on the words vidrunt and jubilati and, conversely, the melismatic singing, particularly on the final syllable ra of terra. Example 8:1. The Gregorian Chant of Hildegard of Bingen. Gregorian chant was composed by churchwomen as well as churchmen. One of the most remarkable contributors to the repertoire of Gregorian chant was Hildegard of Bingen, from whose pen we received 77 chants. Hildegard was the 10th child of noble parents who gave her to the church as a tithe. She was educated by Benedictine nuns and then, at the age of 52, founded her own convent near the small town of Bingen, Germany, on the west bank of the Rhine. Over time, Hildegard manifested her extraordinary intellect and imagination as a playwright, poet, musician, naturalist, pharmacologist, and visionary. Ironically, then, the first Renaissance man was really a medieval woman, Hildegard of Bingen. Figure 8:1. A 12th century illumination depicting Hildegard of Bingen receiving divine inspiration, perhaps a vision or a chant, directly from the heavens. To the right, her secretary, the monk Volmar, peeks in on her in amazement. Copyright Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Hildegard's O Rubor Sanguinis possesses many qualities typical of her chants, and of chant generally. First, it sets a starkly vivid text, which Hildegard herself created. Honoring St. Ursula and a group of 11,000 Christian women believed slain by the Huns in the 4th or 5th century, the poem envisages martyred blood streaming in the heavens and virginal flowers unsullied by serpentine evil. Each phrase of text receives its own phrase of music. And although it sweeps along melodically, having an unusually wide range for a chant, the melody sounds grounded tonally, each phrase ending with the 1st or 5th degree of the scale, with D or A. Notice that after an initial jump in the first 2 pitches, the chant proceeds mostly in stepwise motion. This was, after all, choral music to be sung by the full community of musically unsophisticated nuns or monks, so it had to be easy. Finally, as with most chants, this piece has no overt rhythm or meter. The unaccompanied, monophonic line and the absence of rhythmic drive allow a restful, meditative mood to develop. Hildegard did not see herself as an artist as we think of one today, but in the spirit of medieval anonymity only as a vessel through which divine revelation came to earth. Indeed, she styled herself simply, a feather floating on the breath of God. Figure 8:2. A vision of Hildegard revealing how a fantastic winged figure of God the Father, the Son, and the mystical Lamb killer the serpent Satan with a blazing sword. Hildegard receives the vision and reports it to her secretary. This manuscript dates from the 12th century. Copyright the Art Archive Biblioteca Civica, Lucca, Italy. Gianni dagli Orti. Example 8:2 Hildegard of Bingen, O Rubor Sanguinis. Chant at the top of the charts. In recent years, Gregorian chant has become surprisingly popular. The excitement began in 1994 with the release, appropriately enough by Angel Records, of the CD Chant, which sold 1 million copies within the first 2 months of its appearance. That success spawned sequels, leading eventually to Chant 4. More recently, the album Chant, Music for Paradise shot to number 7 in the British pop charts, outselling releases from Amy Winehouse and Madonna. Much of the popularity of Gregorian chant can be attributed to the fact that it has stylistic traits in common with New Age music. Both project smooth, uniform, rhythmically fluid sounds that are decidedly non-assertive and non-confrontational, the ultimate formula for relaxation and stress relief. Copyright Woody Stockalamy. Hildegard, too, has been popularized as something of a New Age cult figure. She is a fixture on the internet, where you can study her chants in the original notation, find translations of her poetry, view spectacular medieval depictions of her visions, and order the latest CDs or DVDs. A Google search will return more than 320,000 results for Hildegard of Bingen. Most recently, her chant O Rubor Sanguinis featured prominently in the score of the 2006 Academy Award-winning film Crash. More than half of her chants can now be seen and heard on YouTube, and tens of thousands of listeners have done so. Could the visionary nun have foreseen that this intensely spiritual music would become such an overtly commercial success? Music in the cathedral. Gregorian chant arose primarily in secluded monasteries and convents around Western Europe. The future of art music within the church, however, rested not in rural monasteries but rather in urban cathedrals. Every cathedral served as the home church of a bishop, and the bishop could minister to the largest flock by locating himself within the increasingly large urban centers. During the 12th century, cities such as Milan, Paris, and London, among others, grew significantly as trade and commerce increased. Much of the commercial wealth generated in the cities was used to construct splendid new cathedrals that served as both houses of worship and monuments of civic pride. So substantial was this building campaign that the period 1150–1350 is often called the Age of the Cathedrals. Most were constructed in what we now call the Gothic style, with pointed arches, high ceiling vaults, supporting buttresses, and richly colored stained glass. Download supplementary listening guides for 3 more pieces by Hildegard of Bingen, Columba Aspexit, O Successors, and Ordo Virtutum, at the text website. Notre Dame of Paris. Gothic architecture began in northern France, in the region that now has Paris as its capital. The Cathedral of Paris, dedicated to Notre Dame, was begun about 1160, yet not completed until more than 100 years later. Throughout this period, Notre Dame was blessed with a succession of churchmen who were not only theologians and philosophers but poets and musicians as well. Foremost among these were Master Leon Inus and Master Perrault Inus, called the Great. Leon Inus wrote a great book of religious music. Perrault Inus revised Leoninus's book and also composed many additional pieces of his own. Figure 8.3. The Cathedral of Notre Dame of Paris, begun c. 1160, was one of the first to be built in the new Gothic style of architecture. The polyphony of Master Leon Inus and Master Perrault Inus was composed as the building was being constructed. Copyright Catapult Photo Library. Leon Inus and Perrault Inus created a new style of composition. They wrote polyphony and not merely monophonic Gregorian chant. In truth, earlier composers had written polyphony, but this earlier music rarely had voices or lines that were fully separate from the chant. The novelty of the new music arising in Paris rested in the fact that Parisian composers added one or more wholly independent voices above the existing chant. In this musical development we see an early instance of a creative spirit breaking free of the ancient authority of the Church. Perrault Inus, Organum Vidrant Omnes. The surviving documents from Paris suggest that Perrault Inus the Great served as director of the choir at Notre Dame of Paris. To lend special splendor to the celebration of Mass on Christmas morning in the year 1198, Perrault Inus composed a 4-voice organum, the name given to early church polyphony. He took the centuries-old chant for the Mass, Vidrant Omnes, and added 3 new voices above it. Compared to the new upper voices, the old borrowed chant moved very slowly, drawing out or holding each pitch. Because of this, the sustaining line with the chant came to be called the tenor voice. As you listen to the work of Perrault Inus, you will clearly hear the sustaining chant that provides a harmonic support for the upper voices, just as a massive pillar in a Gothic church might support the delicate movement of the arches above. Equally audible is the jaunty triple rhythm, often seeming to move in 2-bar units in a fast tempo. By 1200 musicians had devised a system to notate and control not only pitch, but also rhythm. Significantly, all early polyphony written in rhythmic notation was composed in triple meter, as the music theorists of the time tell us. This was done to honor the Holy Trinity. Figure 8.4. Perraultinus's 4-voice Vidrant Omnes for Christmas Day. Note how the chant in the tenor voice provides a long note foundation for the 3 voices above. Ms. Pludius 29, Biblioteca Laurenziana, Florence. Photo Craig Wright. Download a supplementary listening guide for Perrault Inus, Diffusa est Grazia, at the text website. Notre Dame of Reims. Notre Dame of Paris was not the only important cathedral in Northern Europe devoted to Our Lady. The city of Reims, 100 miles east of Paris in the Champagne region of France, was graced with a monument equally large and impressive. In the 14th century, it, too, benefited from the service of a poetically and musically talented churchman, Guillaume de Machaut. Judging by his nearly 150 surviving works, not only was Machaut the most important composer of his day, he was equally esteemed as a lyric poet. Today, historians of literature place him on a pedestal next to his slightly younger English counterpart, Geoffrey Chaucer, author of the Canterbury Tales. Indeed, Chaucer knew and borrowed heavily from the poetic works of Machaut. Machaut, Messe de Notre Dame. Machaut's Messe de Notre Dame is deservedly the best-known work in the entire repertoire of medieval music. It is impressive for its 25-minute length and the novel way it applies music to the texts of the Mass, the central and most important service of the Roman Catholic Church. Before Machaut's time, composers writing polyphony for the Mass had set only one or two sections of what is called the proper of the Massachusetts Parodonis's Vidrunt Omnes, for example, is a setting of the gradual of the proper of the Mass for Christmas Day. Figure 8, 5. Interior of the Cathedral of Reims looking from floor to ceiling. The pillars carry the eye up to the ribbed vaults of the roof, creating a feeling of great upward movement, just as the Mass of Machaut, with 4 superimposed voices, has a new sense of verticality. Copyright Craig Wright. Machaut, on the other hand, chose to set all of the chants of the ordinary of the Mass. Setting the ordinary had the obvious practical advantage that the composition could be heard on more than just one feast day of the church year. Machaut's Mass of Our Lady, for example, could be sung any time a Mass in honor of the Virgin Mary was celebrated. The accompanying box lists the musical portions of the Mass and the order in which they are sung. From Machaut's work onward, composing a Mass meant setting the 5 texts of the ordinary and finding some way to shape them into an integrated whole. Palestrina, Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven were just a few of the later composers to follow Machaut's lead and set the 5 parts of the ordinary of the Mass. To construct his Mass, Machaut added 3 new voices to a pre-existing chant, but in a way different from that used by Perrault-Inous before him. Whereas Perrault-Inous had placed all 3 new voices above the tenor line, Machaut added just 2 voices above. These came to be called the superius and the contractitenor altus, whence we get our terms soprano and alto. The voice added below the tenor was called the contractitenor bassus, whence our term bass. And unlike Perrault-Inous, who bunched his voices all together in the same range around middle C, Machaut spread his voices out over 2.5 octaves, making him the first composer to exploit nearly the full vocal range of a chorus. But as you will hear, this polyphony is often dissonant and biting, resolving to open, consonant chords only at the ends of phrases. These chords sound especially rich in an echo-filled medieval cathedral where the open sonorities can swirl and endlessly rebound around bare stone walls. Download supplementary listening guides for 3 more pieces by Machaut, Agnus Dei of Messe de Notre Dame and the secular songs Pousse Chou en Oubli and Quant en Moi, at the text website. Example 8, 3. Musical portions of the Mass. Proper of the Mass. Ordinary of the Mass 1. Introit, an introductory chant for the entry of the celebrating clergy. 2. Kyrie 3. Gloria 4. Gradual. 5. Alleluia or tract. 6. Credo 7. Offertory. 8. Sanctus. 9. Agnus Dei 10. Communion. Listening exercise 12. Macbot. Kyrie of Messe de Notre Dame. The Kyrie of the Ordinary of the Mass is a threefold petition for mercy. In Machaut's setting, the composer makes use of pre-existing monophonic chant in 2 ways. He sets it in the tenor voice in long notes and builds polyphony around it, and he requires that sections of the Kyrie be sung in chant alone. On this recording, when the chant alone is heard, it is sung by men in unison. Your task in this listening exercise is straightforward: identify which sections are composed in 4-voice polyphony and which make use of monophonic. 1, 4, 6. 1, 2, 4. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Gregorian chant by writing either polyphony or chant in the blanks below. 1. Kyrie eleison 2. Kyrie eleison 3. Kyrie eleison 4. Christ-eleison 5. Christ-eleison 6. Christ-eleison 7. Kyrie-eleison 8. Kyrie-eleison 9. Kyrie-eleison 10. Finally, notice that each of the polyphonic sections takes longer to perform than the monophonic ones. Why is that the case? A. Because the soloists singing polyphony have more words to sing in each section. B. Because singing the tenor in longer notes in the polyphony causes the music to be drawn out. Music at the court. Outside the walls of the cathedral, there was yet another musical world, one of popular song and dance centered at the court. Indeed, the court embraced forms of public entertainment not permitted by church authorities. Itinerant actors, jugglers, jesters, and animal acts all provided welcome diversions. Minstrels wandered from castle to castle, bringing the latest tunes, along with news and gossip. Churchmen, too, sojourned at court. Guillaume de Machaut, for example, enjoyed a double career as cleric and courtier. He composed liturgical music for the Cathedral of Reims, yet at various times in his life, he served at the court of the King of Bohemia, the King of Navarre, and the Duke of Berry. While it may seem strange that a clergyman like Machaut was active in worldly affairs at court, during the Middle Ages learned churchmen were much in demand for their ability to read and write. And because of their skill with letters and their knowledge of musical notation gained in the church, clerics were inevitably drawn to the poetry and music of the courtly song. Indeed, most of the polyphonic love songs emanating from the court in the late Middle Ages were written by ordained priests. The court emerged as a center for the patronage of the arts during the years 1150, 1400, as the power of the church gradually declined. Kings, dukes, counts, and lesser nobles increasingly assumed responsibility for the defense of the land and the administration of justice. The aristocratic court became a small, independent city-state, but one that could move from place to place. To enhance the ruler's prestige and show that he or she was a person of refinement and sensibility, nobles often engaged bands of trumpeters to herald an arrival, instrumentalists to provide dance music for evening entertainment, and singers and poets to create lyric verse. Some poems were meant to be recited, but most were sung. Troubadours and trouvères. Southern France was the center of this new courtly art, though it extended into northern Spain and Italy as well. The poet-musicians who flourished there were known as troubadours and troubadourets. Both terms derived from the verb troubar, which meant to find in the vernacular tongue of medieval southern France. Thus the troubadours and troubadourets were finders or inventors of new modes of verbal and vocal expression. Their art was devoted mainly to the creation of songs of love that extolled the courtly ideals of faith and devotion, whether to the ideal lady, the just seigneur, or the knight crusading in the Holy Land. Their songs were not in the Latin of the Church, but in the vernacular tongue, medieval Italian, Catalan, and Provençal. The origins of the troubadours were equally varied. Some were sons of bakers and drapers, others were members of the nobility, many were clerics living outside the church, and not a few were women. In the Middle Ages, and later during the Renaissance, women were not allowed to sing in church, except in convents, owing to the biblical command of St. Paul. But at court, women often recited poetry, sang, and played musical instruments, performing on instruments like the harp, flute, and vielle or rebec. Moreover, troubadourets were not merely performers, but creators in their own right. One such composer was Beatrice, Countess of Dieu, who lived in southern France in the mid-12th century. She was married to Count William of Poitiers but fell in love with a fellow troubadour, Raimbaut d'Orange. Her song A Chantar Emer laments her failure in love, despite her self-proclaimed Cha-RMS. It is composed of 5 strophes, or stanzas, each with even line S of text and 7 musical phrases. The 7-phrase melody displays a clear music form, a baptb. As with the chant of the church, troubadour song has no clearly articulated meter and rhythm, but is sung in notes of more or less equal length. Figure 8, 6. A 13th-century Spanish miniature showing a medieval fiddle on the left and a lute on the right. Both instruments were brought into Spain by the Arabs and then carried northward into the lands of the troubadours and trouvères. The Art Archive Real Monasterio del Escorial, Spain. Lori Platt Winfrey. Gradually, the musical traditions created by the troubadours were carried to the north of France, where such composer-performers came to be called trouvères, and even to Germany, where they were called minzingers. Around 1300 some of the trouvères began to mix the traditions of the troubadours with the learned vocal polyphony coming from the church. Soon churchmen such as Guillaume de Machaut adopted the musical forms and poetic style of the Travers to fashion a new genre of music, the polyphonic chanson. The chanson is simply a love song, normally in French, for 2, 3, or 4 voices. At its best, the chanson is a small jewel of poignant lyricism. Figure 8, 7. Beatrice Countess of Dia is depicted in a manuscript of troubadour and Travers poetry. Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Music at the court of Burgundy. During the late Middle Ages, the court of Burgundy was the envy of all courts in Western Europe. Its army was the most powerful, its arts the most beautiful, and its fashions the trendiest. Moreover, the Burgundian treasury was the richest, primarily because the Dukes of Burgundy controlled not only the territory of Burgundy in eastern France but also parts of northern France as well as most of modern-day Belgium and Holland. Among the musicians of Burgundy were Gilles Binchois and Guillaume Dufay, both of whom excelled at writing chansons. Although ordained priests, both moved easily between ecclesiastical and courtly circles. Figure 8, 8. Guillaume Dufay and Gilles Binchois as depicted in a manuscript copied c. 1440. Dufay stands next to a small organ, the quintessential instrument of the church, while Binchois holds a harp, one of the principal instruments of the court. Copyright Giroudon the Bridgeman Art Library International. The sounds that typically grace a French chanson can be heard in Ce mois de mai by Guillaume Dufay. In the Middle Ages, May marked the beginning of the season of love, in which a lad might approach his lass with flowers in hopes that love would bloom. The effervescent quality of Dufay's music, created here by sprightly rhythms and a tuneful melody, suggests all the youthful optimism of spring. Medieval poets and musicians called the form of Ce mois de mai a rondo because a musical refrain appears several times. There are 2 musical sections to which a text refrain is often set. Toward the end, the composer himself invites all to join the song and dance, the youthful participants likely whirling around a circle in a traditional round dance. Throughout history, popular songs, including many by tunesmiths such as Dufay, Machaut, and Michael Jackson, were conceived as much as dance numbers as they were as vocals. Medieval musical instruments. In the late Middle Ages, the principal musical instrument of the monastery and cathedral was the large pipe organ. Indeed, the organ was the only instrument admitted by church authorities. At court, however, a variety of instrumental sounds could be heard. Some, such as the trumpet and early trombone, were rightly identified as loud. Others, such as the fiddle, harp, lute, flute, and small portable organ, were classified as soft. Figure 8, 9. Hans Memling, musical angels painted for the walls of a hospital in Bruges, Belgium. The depiction of the instruments is remarkably detailed. Copyright Scala Art Resource, New York. Figure 8-9 shows a group of angels playing musical instruments of the late medieval period. While this vision of loveliness may be alluring, we must proceed with caution. Never trust a musical angel. How are we to know what instruments angels played? And certainly, any attempt to form an ensemble combining a straight trumpet, rudimentary trombone, harp, portative organ, and fiddle would have been doomed to failure. The loud brasses would have overwhelmed the soft organ and strings. Nevertheless, from such a painting we can extract precise information about the size, construction, and method of playing of each instrument. Download supplementary listening guides for 2 more pieces by Dufay, Ave Maris Stella and Lamentatio Sancti Matris Ecclesiae Constantinopolitani, at the text website. Take, for example, the vielle, the medieval fiddle, to the far right, a distant ancestor of the modern violin. Like all medieval bowed string instruments, it was played off the shoulder. Looking more carefully, we see 5 strings, the standard number for the vielle. They were tuned in a way that made it very easy to play block chords, just the way guitars today can easily produce basic triads, or bar chords. In fact, the easily portable vielle served the function of our modern guitar in medieval society. Not only could it play a melody, it could also provide a basic chordal accompaniment for songs and dances. To hear the sound of the vielle, return to the beginning of the troubadour chanson A Chantar Emer by Beatrice, Countess of Dia. Here the medieval fiddle provides a lengthy solo introduction and then goes on to accompany the voice for the duration of the song. A complete checklist of musical style for the Middle Ages can be found at the text website. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lecture at Open Yale courses and complete this chapter's listening exercises interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: Gregorian chant, plainsong, syllabic singing, melismatic singing, organum, tenor, mass. Proper of the Mass, ordinary of the Mass, troubadour, troubaretz, trouvère, minzinger, chanson, rondeau, vielle. Renaissance music, 1450–1609. Historians use the term Renaissance to designate the period 1350–1600 during which Western Europe experienced a rebirth of interest in classical antiquity and a reawakening of interest in the fine arts generally. Music historians, however, usually apply the term more narrowly, to indicate the time span from 1450 to 1600. In these years, composers began to think of themselves as independent artists, rather than servants of the church, and music theorists rediscovered ancient Greek treatises on music, which changed the way musicians created and thought about music. Ancient Greece and Rome, of course, were pagan, non-Christian cultures. As a result, the Renaissance, while still a religious period in many ways, was decidedly more worldly, or secular, in its outlook. The surviving music of the Middle Ages is overwhelmingly religious in character. By contrast, the music of the Renaissance is more or less equally divided between religious music, used in worship, and secular music, serving as popular entertainment for private music making at home. The Renaissance originated in Italy, in large measure because the manuscripts and ruins of classical antiquity lay all around. Greek and Roman design showed how buildings might be constructed and what sort of statues might be placed in them. See Figure 9.4. Similarly, Greek and Roman literature suggested how poetry should be written and public speeches composed. So, too, the ancient philosophers provided guidelines as to how leaders should act, as well as a new way of thinking about the fine arts. The ancient Greek writers, especially Homer and Plato, had spoken of the great emotional power of music. Their stories told how music had calmed the agitated spirit or made brave the warrior. Musicians in the Renaissance eagerly embraced this notion that music could sway the emotions, and even the behavior, of listeners. Consequently, composers of the Renaissance began to intensify the vocabulary of musical expression. Music, they believed, should underscore and heighten the meaning of each and every phrase of the text. If the verse depicted birds soaring gracefully in the sky, the accompanying music should be in a major key and ascend into a high range. If the text lamented the pain and sorrow of sin, the music ought to be in a minor key, and dark and dissonant. As a result, the Renaissance produced a greater range of musical styles, mirroring the development of the visual arts of the Renaissance, which now likewise allowed for a greater range of emotional expression. Compare, for example, the highly contrasting moods of two paintings created within a few years of each other: the peaceful serenity of Leonardo da Vinci's Madonna, Child, Saint Anne, and a Lamb, and the painful intensity of Matthias Grunewald's St. John and the Two Marys. Figure 9.1. Andrea Palladio's Villa Rotonda near Vicenza, Italy, clearly shows the extent to which classical architecture was reborn during the Renaissance. Elements of the ancient style include the columns with capitals, triangular pediments, and central rotunda. Camera Photo Arte, Venice Art Resource, New York. Figure 9.2. Leonardo da Vinci's Madonna, Child, Saint Anne, and a Lamb. Notice the warm, human expression and the near-complete absence of religious symbolism, as well as the highly formalistic composition of the painting. The groupings of figures form successively larger triangles. Copyright Giroudon, the Bridgman Art Library International. Figure 9.3. The expressive grief of the Virgin, St. John, and Mary Magdalene mark this portion of an altarpiece painted by Matthias Grunewald. Musée d'Unterlinden, France, the Bridgman Art Library International. Attending the rebirth of the arts and letters of classical antiquity was a renewed interest in humankind itself. We have come to call this enthusiastic self-interest humanism. Simply said, humanism is the belief that people are something more than a mere conduit for gifts descending from heaven, that they have the capacity to create many things good and beautiful, indeed, the ability to shape their own world. The culture of the Middle Ages, as we have seen, was fostered by the Church, which emphasized a collective submission to the Almighty, hiding the individual human form beneath layers of clothing. The culture of the Renaissance, by contrast, rejoiced in the human form in all its fullness. It looked outward and indulged a passion for invention and discovery. Figure 9.4. Michelangelo's giant statue of David expresses the heroic nobility of man in near-perfect form. Like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo made a careful study of human anatomy. Alinari, the Bridgman Art Library International. True to the humanistic spirit, composers in the Renaissance began to think of themselves not merely as anonymous churchmen, but as talented artists, and they sought credit for their musical creations. Composers now worked their own names into the texts of their compositions, just as painters painted their own faces among the crowd on their canvases. A composition or a painting came to be viewed as a tangible record of the individual creative genius, and the artist was eager to take a bow. Moreover, he wanted to be paid, and paid well. Medieval craftsmen had traditionally belonged to guilds, which regulated both what type of work they could accept and what they might earn. In the Renaissance, however, this system began to break down. Now a gifted artist might vie for the highest paying commission, just as a sought-after composer might play one patron off against another for the highest salary. Money, it seems, could prime the pump of creativity, leading to greater productivity. This productivity, in turn, was in some cases richly rewarded. The prolific Michelangelo left an estate worth some $10 million in terms of money today. If artists were paid more in the Renaissance, it was because art was now thought to be more valuable. For the first time in the Christian West, there emerged the concept of a work of art, the belief that an object might not only serve as a religious symbol but also be a creation of purely aesthetic value and enjoyment. Music in the Renaissance was composed by proud artists who aimed to give pleasure. Their music conversed, not with eternity, but with the listener. It was judged good or bad only to the degree that it pleased fellow human beings. Music and the other arts could now be freely evaluated, and composers and painters could be ranked according to their greatness. Artistic judgment, appreciation, and criticism entered Western thought for the first time in the humanistic Renaissance. Josquin des Prez and the Renaissance Motet. Josquin des Prez was one of the greatest composers of the Renaissance or, indeed, of any age. He was born somewhere near the present border between France and Belgium about 1455, and died in the same region in 1521. Yet, like so many musicians of northern France, he was attracted to Italy to pursue professional and monetary gain. Between 1484 and 1504, he worked for various dukes in Milan and Ferrara, and for the Pope in his Sistine Chapel in Rome. Evidence suggests that Josquin had a temperamental, egotistical personality, one typical of many artists of the Renaissance. He would fly into a rage when singers tampered with his music. He composed only when he, not his patron, wished, and he demanded a salary twice that of composers only slightly less gifted. Yet Josquin's contemporaries recognized his genius. Martin Luther said of him, "Josquin is master of the notes, which must express what he desires. Other composers can do only what the notes dictate." And Florentine humanist Cosimo Bartoli compared him to the great Michelangelo. Figure 9.5. The only surviving portrait of Josquin des Prez. Copyright Private Collection, the Bridgman Art Library International. Josquin may be said to have been a prodigy of nature, as our Michelangelo Buonarroti has been in architecture, painting, and sculpture, for just as there has not yet been anyone who in his compositions approaches Josquin, so Michelangelo, among those active in his arts, is still alone and without a peer. Both Josquin and Michelangelo have opened the eyes of all those who delight in these arts or are to delight in them in the future. Figure 9.6. Interior of the Sistine Chapel. The high altar and Michelangelo's Last Judgment are at the far end, the balcony for the singers, including Josquin des Prez, at the lower right. The congregants could stand and listen from the near side of the screen. Superstock. Josquin composed in all of the musical genres of his day, but he excelled in writing motets, some 70 of which survive under his name. The Renaissance motet can be defined as a composition for a choir, setting a Latin text on a sacred subject, and intended to be sung either in a church or chapel, or at home in private devotion. While composers of the Renaissance continued to set the prescribed text of the Mass, they increasingly sought more dramatic texts in the Old Testament of the Bible, specifically, in the expressive Psalms and the mournful Lamentations. A vivid text cried out for an equally vivid musical setting, allowing the composer to fulfill a mandate of Renaissance humanism: use music to heighten the meaning of the word. Most motets in the Renaissance, as well as most masses for the church, were sung a cappella, meaning that they were performed by voices alone, without any instrumental accompaniment. This, in part, accounts for the often serene quality of the sound of Renaissance sacred music. Indeed, the Renaissance has been called the golden age of a cappella singing. Download supplementary listening guides for 2 more pieces by Josquin des Prez, Kyrie, and Gloria of Missa Pange Lingua, at the text website. Josquin's motet Ave Maria was written about 1485 when the composer was in Milan, Italy, in the service of the Duke of Milan. Composed in honor of the Virgin Mary, it employs the standard 4 voice parts, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. As the motet unfolds, the listener hears the voices enter in succession with the same musical motive. This process is called imitation, a procedure whereby one or more voices duplicate in turn the notes of a melody. Example 9:1. Josquin also sometimes has one pair of voices imitate another, the tenor and bass, for example, imitating what the alto and soprano have just sung. Example 9:2. In Josquin's imitative writing, each voice is given equal opportunity to present the melodic material, thus, all 4 voices are of equal importance. Josquin and his contemporaries favored this texture of 4 equal voices in part because of its potential to yield symmetry and balance. Agreeable proportions were prized not only in Renaissance music but also in the arts generally during this period. As the 4 voices enter independently, they invariably create counterpoint, individual voices working with and against one another in harmonious fashion. In Josquin's Ave Maria, sections in imitative counterpoint alternate with passages of chordal writing to achieve variety and thereby maintain the listener's interest. Josquin organizes the overall structure of Ave Maria in much the same manner that a humanistic orator would construct a persuasive speech or address. It begins with a salutation to the Virgin, sung in imitation. Thereafter, a key word, Ave, sparks a succession of salutes to the Virgin, each making reference to one of her principal feast days during the church year. At the end of this series of hails comes a final exclamation, O Mother of God, be mindful of me. Amen. These last words are set to striking chords, with each syllable of text receiving its own chord. The chordal, homophonic treatment allows this final text to stand out with absolute clarity, again observing the principle of musical humanism. Text and music must work together to persuade and move the listener. Here they must persuade the Virgin Mary as well, for they plead with her to intercede on behalf of the needy soul at the hour of death. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 15, Benedictine Chant and Music in the Sistine Chapel, at the text website. Listening Exercise 14. Josquin des Prez Ave Maria. 19. 15. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Josquin's Ave Maria is a fine example of a motet that employs imitation, the musical technique favored by Renaissance composers for church music. What follows is mainly an exercise in hearing the 4 voices unfold in imitative counterpoint and identifying how Josquin clarifies the meaning of the text. On this modern recording, the soprano part is sung by women, and the alto, tenor, and bass parts by men. 1. As the 4 voices enter, which texture gradually emerges? A. Monophonic. B. Homophonic. C. Polyphonic. 2. What is the term for the musical procedure in which the voices replicate in turn the notes of a melody? A. Imitation. B. Replication. C. Modulation. 3. The opening stanza of Ave Maria contains 8 words divided into 4 syntactical units: Ave Maria, Gratia Plena, Dominus Tecum, Virgo Serena. Josquin clarifies the meaning of the text by grouping the words in pairs, and he does so how? A. By assigning each pair of words first to the soprano and then to the other voices. B. By assigning each pair of words first to the bass and then to the other voices. 4. Now the voices work toward a joyful climax on the word Laetitia, and Josquin expresses the meaning of this passage by writing music that does what? A. Ascends and then descends in an excited fashion. B. Forcefully reiterates the same pitches. C. Emphatically descends to a lower range. 5. Which voice joyfully sings the final Laetitia? A. Soprano. B. Male alto. C. Bass. 6. A new stanza of text appears, and the meter and texture change for the sake of variety. Which is correct? A. Triple meter polyphony gives way to duple meter homophony. B. Duple meter homophony gives way to triple meter polyphony. C. Duple meter polyphony gives way to triple meter homophony. 7. The final word of the motet is Amen, which is Hebrew for, and so be it. Josquin declaims the meaning of this word by having the voices sing what with emphasis. A, and men to two different pitches, B, A, and men to the same pitches. 8, which is true throughout this motet. A, in the imitative sections, the soprano and alto always enter before the tenor and bass. B, in the imitative sections, the tenor and bass always enter before the soprano and alto. 9. Do instruments accompany the voices on this performance? If not, what is this style of performance called? A, imitative. B, a cappella. C, Vatican style. 10. Most listeners would agree that Josquin's Ave Maria is a soothing auditory experience, an appropriate companion for the image of the Virgin Mary within the Roman Catholic Church. Which single answer best suggests why? A, the voices are equal in importance. B, the dynamics stay in the middle range of loud and soft. C, there is no strongly emphasized beat. D, there is no strong element of dissonance in the counterpoint. E, all of the above. F, none of the above. The Counter-Reformation and Palestrina. On October 31, 1517, an obscure Augustinian monk named Martin Luther nailed to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, Germany, 95 complaints against the Roman Catholic Church, his famous 95 Theses. With this defiant act, Luther began what has come to be called the Protestant Reformation. Luther and his fellow reformers sought to bring an end to corruption within the Roman Catholic Church, the selling of indulgences, the unholy lives of leading churchmen, and the abuse of power in church appointments. By the time the Protestant Reformation had run its course, most of Germany, Switzerland, and the Low Countries, and all of England, as well as parts of France, Austria, Bohemia, Poland, and Hungary, had gone over to the Protestant cause. The established Roman Catholic Church was shaken to its very foundations. In response to the Protestant Reformation, the Church of Rome began to clean its own house. The cleansing applied not only to matters of spirituality and church administration but also to art, liturgy, and music. A list of offending books was compiled, and often they, along with their authors, were publicly burned. Nudity in religious paintings, musical instruments within the church, popular tunes and catchy rhythms in the midst of polyphonic masses, and married church singers, all of these transgressions were now deemed inappropriate to a truly pious environment. The reform movement that promoted a more conservative, austere approach to art is called the Counter-Reformation, and the musician whose music most embodies its spirit is Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina. Figure 9.7. Portrait of Giovanni Palestrina, the first important composer of the church to have been a layman rather than a member of the clergy. Copyright Scala Art Resource, New York. Palestrina was born in the small town of that name outside Rome and spent almost his entire professional life as a singer and composer at various churches in and around the Vatican, St. Peter's Basilica, St. John Lateran, St. Mary Major, and the Sistine Chapel, the Pope's private chapel within his Vatican apartments. But in 1555, Paul IV, one of the more zealous of the reforming popes, dismissed Palestrina from the Sistine Chapel because he was a married layman not conforming to the strict rule of celibacy. Later, under a new pope, Palestrina returned to papal employment at St. Peter's, holding the titles Maestro di Cappella and ultimately Maestro Compositor. Palestrina's tenure at the Sistine Chapel coincided with the Council of Trent, a 2-decade-long conference at which leading cardinals and bishops undertook a reform of the Roman Catholic Church. What bothered the reformers most about the sacred music of the church was that the incessant entry of voices in musical imitation obscured the text, excessively dense counterpoint was burying the word of the Lord. As one well-placed bishop said mockingly, "In our times they have put all their industry and effort into the writing of imitative passages, so that while one voice says Sanctus, another says Sabaoth, still another says Gloria Tua, with howling, bellowing, and stammering, so that they more nearly resemble cats in January than flowers in May." Download a supplementary listening guide for the Kyrie of Palestrina's Missa Papae Marcelli at the text website. Initially, the assembled prelates considered banning music altogether from the service or limiting it to just the old, monophonic Gregorian chant. But the timely appearance of a few sacred compositions by Palestrina showed the council that sacred polyphony for 4, 5, or 6 voices could still be written in a clear, dignified manner. For his role in maintaining a place for composed polyphony within the established church, Palestrina came to be called, perhaps with some exaggeration, the savior of church music. Most famous of all Counter-Reformation compositions is Palestrina's Missa Papae Marcelli, which the composer said was written in a new manner. By this, Palestrina meant that he had set the text of the Mass with exceptional clarity, allowing the music to inspire the listener to greater piety and devotion. To see how Palestrina imposed this clarity of expression through music, let us explore two contrasting sections of his Mass. The first is the Gloria of the Mass, a lengthy hymn of praise in honor of the majestic Christ. Here Palestrina commands the singers to declaim the text triumphantly, mostly in block chords, with the rhythm of the music emphasizing the accents in the Latin text. Who could possibly miss the meaning of the words as the singers seemingly spit out the text? By contrast, the Agnus Dei of the Mass commemorates the tender, merciful Lamb of God. Now Palestrina deploys imitation with peacefully overlapping lines, but each phrase of text is kept separate from the next and remains clearly audible. What Palestrina proved to the prelates of the Council of Trent remains true for us today: clarity of expression and beauty are not mutually exclusive. Male choirs, the castrato. As mentioned in our discussion of medieval music, women were allowed to sing in the early Roman Catholic Church in convents but not in any public church. Similarly, women were not allowed to appear in public in theatrical productions within territories under strict church control. Thus most church choirs in the Middle Ages and Renaissance were exclusively male. But who, then, sang the soprano and alto parts when polyphony was performed? The most common practice was to assign these parts to adult males who sang in what is called head voice, or falsetto. Alternatively, choir boys might be used, but they were expensive to house and educate. Finally, beginning in 1562, the castrato voice was introduced into the papal chapel, mainly as a money-saving measure. A single castrato could produce as much volume as 2 falsettists or 3 or 4 boys. Castrati were renowned for their power and their great lung capacity, which allowed them to execute unusually long phrases in a single breath. Surprisingly, castrati sopranos remained a hallmark of the papal chapel until 1903, when they were officially banned by Pope Pius X. Nevertheless, the voice of one castrato, Alessandro Morisci, known as the last castrato, was captured on phonograph recording between 1902 and 1904 and is readily available for listening today. All-male choir with choir boys for the soprano part as depicted in a 16th-century Italian fresco. Copyright Scala Art Resource, New York. On our recording of sections of Palestrina's Missa Papae Marcelli, women take the soprano line, while male falsettists and women share the alto part. To make their sound as close as possible to that of a choir boy, the women sing with almost no vibrato. Hear Alessandro Morisci, the last castrato, in the YouTube playlist on the text website. Figure 9.8. Although public church choirs in the Middle Ages and Renaissance were all male ensembles, women could be heard at court and in the home singing secular genres, such as the chanson and madrigal. And women, too, sang in churches, specifically in convents, where they performed all the chant and, when required, polyphony. In this illumination from a 15th-century English liturgical manuscript, nuns sing from their choir stalls. Copyright British Library Board. All rights reserved. The Bridgman Art Library International. Palestrina's serene music best captures the somber, restrained spirit of the Counter-Reformation, embodying in its quiet simplicity all that Roman Catholic authority thought proper church music should be. After his death in 1594, the legend of Palestrina, savior of church music, continued to grow. Later composers such as Bach and Mozart incorporated elements of Palestrina's style into their sacred compositions. Even in our universities today, courses in counterpoint for advanced music students usually include some practice in composing in the pure, contrapuntally correct style of Palestrina. Thus the spirit of the Counter-Reformation, distilled into a set of contrapuntal rules, has continued to influence musicians long after the Renaissance came to an end. Popular music in the Renaissance. The masses and motets of Josquin and Palestrina represent the high art of the Renaissance, learned music for the church. But secular, popular music flourished in the Renaissance as well. Indeed, the 16th century witnessed an increase in commerce and trade, and with it came a growing middle class. Though it constituted only about 6% of the population, the middle class was concentrated in the cities, where the new technology of music printing was beginning to flourish. Naturally, the urban middle class had different, more popular musical tastes than did the high churchmen and the nobles. In truth, there had always been popular music for the less exalted members of society. Dance music and popular songs, for example, are indigenous to all classes in all societies. But like rock musicians today, Popular musicians in the Middle Ages performed without benefit of written musical notation. Most people couldn't read text or music, and manuscripts were exceedingly expensive. All this changed, however, with Johann Gutenberg's invention of printing by movable type around 1460. Printing revolutionized the world of information in the late 15th century no less than did the computer in the late 20th century. Hundreds of copies of a book could be produced quickly and cheaply once the type had been set. The first printed book of music appeared in Venice in 1501, and to this important event can be traced the origins of today's music business. The standard press run for a printed book of music then was usually 500 copies. Mass production put the music book within reach of the banker, merchant, lawyer, and shopkeeper. How-to manuals encouraged ordinary men and women to learn to read musical notation, so as to sing and to play an instrument at home. The learned amateur had arrived. Dance music. Our fascination with dance didn't begin with Dancing with the Stars. Music and dance are likely as old as human life itself. But most dance music before the Renaissance is lost in the mists of time because it, like much popular culture, was not preserved in written form. With the increase in literacy generally, and musical literacy in particular, publishers in 16th century Europe issued collections of dances, assuming that the musically inclined middle class was now ready to dance at home. Dances went by the name of a dance type, such as Bass Dance, Pavane, Galliard, or Brannel, or by the name of a dance type plus the title of the tune, Bass Dance the Admiral, for example. Printers suggested which instruments were most appropriate: flutes, lutes, various keyboard instruments, and even the newly emerging violin are named. Not wishing to lose a single sale, however, publishers would often conclude an advertisement with the all-inclusive encouragement, or suitable for any similar sort of instrument. As visual evidence from the period shows, a group of several shawms and perhaps a sackbut, along with a drum, formed the most common dance band. Figure 9. Musicians in a procession as painted by Dennis van Alsloot, c. 1600. The instruments are, from right to left, a sackbut, 2 shawms, a cornetto, another shawm, and an early bassoon. Copyright Prado, Madrid. The Bridgman Art Library International. By far the most popular type of dance of the mid-16th century was the pavane, a slow, gliding dance in duple meter performed by couples holding hands. It was often followed by a contrasting galliard, a fast, leaping dance in triple meter. Around 1550 the French publisher Jacques Moderne issued a collection of 25 anonymous dances that included several pavanes and galliards. Moderne titled this collection Musique de Joie. Listen and you'll understand why. The madrigal. About 1530, a new kind of popular song took Europe by storm, the madrigal. A madrigal is a piece for several solo voices that sets a vernacular poem, most often about love, to music. The madrigal arose in Italy but soon spread to northern European countries. So popular did the madrigal become that by 1630 some 40,000 pieces had been printed by publishers eager to satisfy public demand. The madrigal was a truly social art, one that both men and women could enjoy. Download supplementary listening guides for additional madrigals, by Weelkes and by John Farmer, at the text website. Of all the musical genres of the Renaissance, the madrigal best exemplifies the humanist requirement that music express the meaning of the text. In a typical madrigal each word or phrase of poetry receives its own musical gesture. Thus, when the madrigal text says, chase after or follow quickly, the music becomes fast, and one voice chases after another in musical imitation. For words such as pain, anguish, death, and cruel fate, the madrigal composer almost invariably employs a twisting chromatic scale or a biting dissonance. This practice of depicting the text by means of a descriptive musical gesture, whether subtly or jokingly as a musical pun, is called word painting. Word painting became all the rage with madrigal composers in Italy and England. Even today such musical clichés as a falling melody for swoon and a dissonance for pain are called madrigalisms. Figure 9-10. Singers of a 4-part madrigal during the mid-16th century. Women were very much a part of this secular, non-religious music making. Copyright Giroudon. The Bridgman Art Library International. Although the madrigal was born in Italy, popular favor soon carried it over the Alps to Germany, Denmark, the Low Countries, and England. The first madrigals to be printed in England appeared in a 1588 publication titled Musica Transalpina, a collection of more than 50 madrigals, mainly by Italian composers, with the text translated into English. Soon English composers, all contemporaries of William Shakespeare, were writing their own madrigals to new English poems. One of the best of the English madrigalists was Thomas Weelkes, an organist who spent most of his career in rural Chichester but ended his days in London, an honorary gentleman of the Chapel Royal. In 1601, Weelkes and 23 other English composers each contributed a madrigal to a collection titled The Triumphs of Oriana, an album of music compiled in honor of the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. Weelkes's contribution to The Triumphs of Oriana was the six-voice madrigal As Vesta Was From Latmos Hill Descending. Its text, likely fashioned by Weelkes himself, is a rather confused mixture of images from classical mythology: the Roman goddess Vesta, descending the Greek mountain of Latmos, spies Oriana ascending the hill, the nymphs and shepherds attending the goddess Diana desert her to sing the praises of Oriana. The sole virtue of this verse is that it provides frequent opportunity for word painting in music. As the text commands, the music descends, ascends, runs, mingles imitatively, and offers mirthful tunes to the maiden queen. Elizabeth herself played lute and harpsichord, and loved to dance. Weelkes saw fit to end his madrigal with cries of "Long live fair Oriana." Indeed, the fair queen did enjoy a long and glorious reign, thus our term, Elizabethan age. Madrigals such as Weelkes's As Vesta Was From Latmos Hill Descending were popular because they were fun to sing. Vocal lines were written within a comfortable range, melodies were often triadic, rhythms were catchy, and the music was full of puns. When Vesta descends the mountain, so too her music moves down the scale. When Oriana ascends, her music does likewise. When Diana, the goddess of virginity, is all alone, you guessed it, we hear a solo voice. With sport like this to be had, no wonder the popularity of the madrigal endured beyond the Renaissance. Even today the madrigal remains a staple of a cappella singing groups and university glee clubs. Figure 9:11. A painting believed to show Queen Elizabeth dancing with the Duke of Leicester. By kind permission of Viscount de Lisle from his private collection at Penshurst Place, Kent, England. A complete checklist of musical style for the Renaissance can be found at the text website. Listening exercise 15. Weelkes. As Vesta Was From Latmos Hill Descending. 114. 16. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. So striking is the depiction of the text through music in the madrigal of the Renaissance that these instances of musical word painting are called madrigalisms. Often the music depicts the text by its motion or by its texture. At these moments the word painting is so obvious as to be amusing, and that makes several of the following questions easy to answer. 1. The text sets the scene of this madrigal at the top of Latmos Hill, a mountain in Greek mythology. At the beginning, we hear sounds that are what? A. Generally low with male voices predominating. B. Generally high with female voices predominating. 2. Which is true about the direction of the music for the words descending and ascending. A. It descends for descending and ascends for ascending. B. It ascends for descending and descends for ascending. C. There is no clear direction, and word painting is not present. 3. Which is true about the music for the words attended on. A. It ascends. B. It descends. C. The singers mostly repeat the same pitches, so the music sounds static. 4. For the word running, what does the music do? A. It goes faster and ascends. B. It goes faster and descends. C. It goes slower and remains stationary in pitch. 5. What is the texture of the music at the words, leaving their goddess? A. Monophony. B. Homophony. C. Imitative polyphony. 6. What is the texture of the music at the words, all alone? A. Monophony. B. Homophony. C. Imitative polyphony. 7. What is the texture at the words, then sang the shepherds? A. Monophony. B. Homophony. C. Imitative polyphony. 8. What is the texture at the words, long live fair Oriana? A. Monophony. B. Homophony. C. Imitative polyphony. 9. When the bass enters with a presentation of long live fair Oriana, what is the nature of the musical line? A. The bass sings long, steady notes to emphasize the word long. B. The bass sings rapid notes, joining the many acclamations of the upper voices. 10. Which of the following is true? A. The performance of this madrigal is a cappella with one singer to a part. B. The performance of this madrigal is a cappella with two singers to a part. C. The performance of this madrigal is not a cappella. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lecture at Open Yale courses and complete this chapter's listening exercises interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: Humanism motet a cappella imitation. Counter-Reformation Sistine Chapel Council of Trent falsetto castrato pavon Galliard madrigal word painting madrigalism. Part 3. The Baroque Period, 1600-1750. Bridgman Girardin Art Resource, New York. 10 Introduction to Baroque Art and Music. 11 Early Baroque Vocal Music. 12 Toward Late Baroque Instrumental Music. 13 The Late Baroque, Bach. 14 The Late Baroque, Handel. The dominant style of architecture, painting, sculpture, music, and dance in the period 1600 to 1750 is called Baroque. It originated first in Rome, as a way to glorify the Counter-Reformation Catholic Church, and then spread beyond Italy to Spain, France, Germany, Austria, the Low Countries, and England. The artists who created Baroque art worked mainly for the Pope and important monarchs throughout Europe. Thus Baroque art is akin to the official art of the ruling establishment. Whereas the art and music of the Renaissance was marked by classical balance and rational restraint, that of the Baroque era is full of grandeur, extravagance, drama, and overt sensuality. This is as true for the music of Claudio Monteverdi at the beginning of the Baroque period as it is of that of Bach and Handel at the end. During the Baroque period, several new musical genres emerge: opera, cantata, and oratorio enter the realm of vocal music, and sonata and concerto appear among the instrumental types. 10 Introduction to Baroque Art and Music. Music historians agree, with unusual unanimity, that Baroque music first appeared in Italy in the early 17th century. To be sure, around 1600, certain qualities of the Italian madrigal, virtuosic solo singing, for example, came to be emphasized in a way that created an entirely new sound. The older equal-voiced choral polyphony of the Renaissance receded in importance as a new, more flamboyant style gained in popularity. Eventually, the new style was given a new name, Baroque. Baroque is the term used to describe the arts generally during the period 1600-1750. It is taken from the Portuguese word barroco, referring to a pearl of irregular shape then used in jewelry and fine decorations. Critics applied the term Baroque to indicate excessive ornamentation in the visual arts and a rough, bold instrumental sound in music. Thus, originally, Baroque had a negative connotation. It signified distortion, excess, and extravagance. Only during the 20th century, with a newfound appreciation of the painting of Peter Paul Rubens and the music of Antonio Vivaldi and J.S. Bach, among others, has the term Baroque come to assume a positive meaning in Western cultural history. Figure 10.1. The High Altar at St. Peter's Basilica, Rome, with baldachin by John Lorenzo Bernini. Standing more than 90 feet high, this canopy is marked by twisted columns and curving shapes, color, and movement, all typical of Baroque art. Copyright Scala Art Resource, New York. Baroque Architecture and Music. What strikes us most when standing before a monument of Baroque design, such as the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome or the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris, is that everything is constructed on the grandest scale. The plazas, buildings, colonnades, gardens, and fountains are all massive. Look at the 90-foot-high altar canopy inside St. Peter's, designed by John Lorenzo Bernini, and imagine how it dwarfs the priest below. Outside the basilica, a circle of colonnades forms a courtyard large enough to encompass several football fields. Or consider the French King's Palace of Versailles, constructed during the reign of Louis XIV, so monumental in scope that it formed a small independent city, home to several thousand court functionaries. The music composed for performance in such vast expanses could also be grandiose. While at first the Baroque orchestra was small, under King Louis XIV, it sometimes swelled to more than 80 players. Similarly, choral works for Baroque churches sometimes required 24, 48, or even 53 separate lines or parts. These compositions for massive choral forces epitomize the grand or colossal Baroque. Once the exteriors of the large Baroque palaces and churches were built, the artists of the time rushed in to fill these expanses with abundant, perhaps even excessive, decoration. It was as if the architect had created a large vacuum, and into it raced the painter, sculptor, and carver to fill the void. Examine again the interior of St. Peter's and notice the ornamentation on the ceiling, as well as the elaborate twists and turns of Bernini's canopy. Or consider the Austrian monastery of St. Florian. There are massive columns, yet the frieze connecting them is richly decorated, as is the ceiling above. Here elaborate scrolls and floral capitals add warmth and humanity to what would otherwise be a vast, cold space. Figure 10.2. St. Peter's Square, designed by Bernini in the mid-17th century. The expanse is so colossal it seems to swallow people, cars, and buses. Copyright Bob Christ Corbis. Similarly, when expressed in the music of the Baroque era, this love of energetic detail within large-scale compositions took the form of a highly ornamental melody set upon a solid chordal foundation. Sometimes the decoration almost seems to overrun the fundamental harmonic structure of the piece. Notice in Figure 10-4 the abundance of melodic flourishes in just a few measures of music for violin by Arcangelo Corelli. Such ornaments were equally popular with the singers of the early Baroque period, when the cult of the vocal virtuoso first emerged. Baroque painting and music. Many of the principles at work in Baroque architecture are also found in Baroque painting and music. Baroque canvases are usually large and colorful. Most important, they are overtly dramatic. Drama in painting is created by means of contrast. Bold colors are pitted against one another, bright light is set against darkness, and lines are placed at right angles to one another, which suggests tension and energetic movement. Figure 10-5 shows Peter Paul Rubens's The Horrors of War. The large canvas swirls with a chaotic scene that is extravagant yet sensual, typical qualities of Baroque art. Barely visible in the right lower foreground is a woman with a broken lute, which symbolizes that harmony cannot exist beside the discord of war. Figure 10-6 paints an even more horrific scene, the woman Judith visiting retribution upon the Assyrian general Holofernes, as depicted by Artemisia Gentileschi. Here the play of light and dark creates a dramatic effect, the stark blue and red colors add intensity, while the head of the victim, set at a right angle to his body, suggests an unnatural motion. Baroque art sometimes delights in the pure shock value of presenting gruesome events from history or myth in a dramatic way. Figure 10.3. Church of the Monastery of St. Florian, Austria. The powerful pillars and arches set a strong structural framework, while the painted ceiling and heavily foliated capitals provide decoration and warmth. Copyright Interfoto Alami. Figure 10.4. Arcangelo Corelli's Sonata for Violin and Basso Continuo, Opus 5, No. 1. The bass provides the structural support, while the violin adds elaborate decoration above. Figure 10.5. Rubens's The Horrors of War is a reaction to the 30 Years' War that ravaged Europe at this time. Here Mars, the god of war, is pulled to the right by Fury and to the left by a mostly naked Venus, goddess of love. Beneath these figures, the populace suffers. Copyright Alinari The Bridgman Art Library International. Music of the Baroque is also highly dramatic. We observed in the music of the Renaissance a growing awareness of the capacity of this art to sway, or affect, the emotions. This led in the early 17th century to an aesthetic theory called the doctrine of affections. The doctrine of affections held that different musical moods could and should be used to influence the emotions, or affections, of the listener. A musical setting should reinforce the intended affection of the text. Yet each work of Baroque art in general confines itself to one specific emotion, keeping each unit of space and expression separate and distinct from the next. There is a unity of mood within each scene. So, too, musicians spoke of the need to dramatize the text yet maintain a single affection, be it rage, revenge, sorrow, joy, or love, from beginning to end of a piece. Not surprisingly, the single most important new genre to emerge in the Baroque period was opera. Here the drama of the stage joined with music to form a powerful new medium. Figure 10.6. Judith beheading Holofernes by Artemisia Gentileschi. The grisly scene of Judith slaying the tyrant general was painted several times by Gentileschi, perhaps as a vivid way of demonstrating her abhorrence of aggressive male domination. Museo e Gallerie Nazionali di Capodimonte, Naples The Bridgman Art Library International. Characteristics of Baroque music. Perhaps more than any other period in the history of music, the Baroque gave rise to a remarkable variety of musical styles, ranging from the expressive monody of Claudio Monteverdi to the complex polyphony of J.S. Bach. It also saw the introduction of many new musical genres: opera, cantata, oratorio, sonata, concerto, and suite, each of which is discussed in the following chapters. Yet despite the quick stylistic changes and all the new types of music created, two elements remain constant throughout the Baroque period: an expressive melody and a strong supporting bass. Expressive melody. Renaissance music, as we saw in Chapter 9, was dominated by polyphonic texture, in which the voices spin out a web of imitative counterpoint. The nature and importance of each of the lines is about equal, as the following graphic suggests. In early Baroque music, however, the voices are no longer equal. Rather, a polarity develops in which the musical emphasis gravitates toward the top and bottom lines. Renaissance vocal music was mostly ensemble music, motets, masses, and madrigals for groups of vocalists, even if there was only one singer on a part. In the early Baroque, however, the musical focus shifts from vocal ensemble to accompanied solo song. A choir might be a useful medium to convey the abstract religious thoughts of the multitudes, but to communicate raw human emotions, direct appeal by an individual soloist now seemed more appropriate. The new kind of solo singing was at first called monody. A single singer stepped forward, accompanied by a very few supporting instruments, to project a highly charged text. Within the medium of monody, the vocal virtuoso would soon emerge, the star of the court theater and the operatic stage. Figure 10:7. A woman playing the theorbo lute and a cavalier by Gerard Terborch. The bass strings are at the top of the instrument and off the fingerboard. The theorbo was often used to play the basso continuo in the 17th century. Image Asset Management Limited Superstock. The basso continuo. Monody emphasizes a solo melody, but one supported by chords springing up vertically from the bass. In simple terms, the soprano carries the melody while the bass provides a strong harmonic support. In between, the middle voices do little more than fill out the texture. If Renaissance music was conceived polyphonically and horizontally, line by line, that of the early Baroque period is organized homophonically and vertically, chord by chord. The bass-driven, chordal support in Baroque music is called the basso continuo, and it is played by one or more instruments. Figure 10:7 shows a woman singing to the accompaniment of a large plucked string instrument called the theorbo. This instrument has more low strings than its close cousin the lute, which allows it to not only strum chords but also play low bass notes. In the early 17th century, a theorbo or some other kind of bass lute often played the basso continuo. Figure 10:8 shows a solo singer, two violinists, and a violist, accompanied by two other instruments, a large double bass, which plays the bass line, and a harpsichord, which improvises chords built above that bass line. The singer, viola, and violins project an expressive melody while the other two instruments provide the basso continuo. Harpsichord and low-string instrument formed the most common basso continuo in the Baroque period. Indeed, it is the continual tinkling of the harpsichord, in step with a strong bass line, that signals the listener that the music being played comes from the Baroque. Coincidentally, this top-bottom makeup of monodic singing in Baroque music is not structurally different from the straight-ahead rock and roll music of today with electric bass. In both styles, an expressive soloist sings above a rock-solid bass, while a keyboardist, building on the bass line, improvises chords in the middle of the texture. Figure 10:8. Antonio Vicentini, Concert at the Villa. Notice how the double bass player at the left turns his head to read the bass line in the score on the harpsichord. Together they provide the basso continuo. Copyright The Art Archive, Johnny Dagli Ordi. What chords did the Baroque harpsichordist play? These were suggested to the performer by means of figured bass, a numerical shorthand placed below the bass line. A player familiar with chord formations would look at the bass line, such as that given in example 10-1a, and improvise chords along the lines of those given in example 10-1b. These improvised chords, generated from the bass according to the numerical code, support a melody above. Here, too, there is a modern parallel. Figured bass is similar in intent to the alphanumerical code found in fake books, used by jazz musicians today, which suggest which chords to play beneath the written melody. Example 10:1. Elements of Baroque music. Baroque music, as we have seen, is marked by grandeur, by passionate expression, and by drama. It is held together by a chordal framework and a strong bass line, both supplied by the basso continuo. These qualities can be heard in all three chronological divisions of Baroque music: early Baroque, middle Baroque, and late Baroque. In the music of the early Baroque in particular, the artistic expression of the voice and the richness of the harmony were especially intense. In the late Baroque, some of the excessively exuberant qualities of early Baroque music would be smoothed out and regularized by Bach and Handel. The following elements, however, are common to all periods of Baroque music. Melody. In the Renaissance, melody was more or less all of one type. It was a direct, uncomplicated line that could be performed by either a voice or an instrument. But in early Baroque music, beginning about 1600, two different melodic styles begin to develop: a dramatic, virtuosic style in singing, and a more mechanical style, full of figural repetitions, in instrumental music. Vocal melody in the Baroque is marked by quick shifts from long notes to very short ones, which creates an excited, exuberant sound. From time to time, the voice will luxuriate in a long flourish as it projects a single syllable in long melisma. Below are two melodies, one from Monteverdi's opera Orfeo from the beginning of the Baroque and the other from Handel's oratorio Messiah from the end of the period. Example 10, 2. Example 10, 3. Generally, Baroque melody does not unfold in short, symmetrical units, but expands luxuriantly, and often unpredictably, over long musical phrases. Harmony. Baroque harmonies are chordally conceived and tightly bound to the basso continuo. Composers in the early 17th century sometimes placed their chords in an order that sounds arbitrary to our modern ears. But as the century progressed, harmonies unfold more and more in patterns familiar to us, and standard harmonic progressions emerge. In other words, chord progressions as we know them come into being. The shortest and most frequent of these is the VI cadence. The advent of standard harmonic progressions like the VI cadence gives added direction and cohesion to the music. Attending this development is the growing importance, and eventual total domination, of the major and minor keys. These two scale patterns, major and minor, replaced the dozen or so scales employed during the Renaissance and before. Moreover, as music was reduced to just two very different qualities of sound, the composer could play the dark minor off against the bright major, just as a painter might contrast light and dark, for particular effect. Rhythm. Rhythm in Baroque music is characterized by uniformity, not flexibility. Just as a single mood, or effect, is carried from the beginning to the end of a piece of Baroque music, so, too, the rhythmic patterns heard at the beginning will surface again and again, right to the end. Moreover, in Baroque music, especially instrumental music, a strong recurring beat is usually clearly audible, which pushes the music forward and creates, in contemporary terms, a groove. This tendency toward rhythmic clarity and drive becomes more and more pronounced as the Baroque period proceeds. It culminates in the rhythmically propulsive music of Vivaldi and Bach. Texture. Baroque composers approached musical texture in ever-changing ways. Texture in the early Baroque is overwhelmingly homophonic, the basso continuo providing a wholly chordal framework. Indeed, composers of the early 17th century rebelled against the predominantly polyphonic, imitative texture of the Renaissance. This initial hostility toward polyphony gradually diminished, however. In the late Baroque, composers such as Bach and Handel returned to contrapuntal writing, in part to add richness to the middle range of the standard top-bottom, dominated texture. Dynamics. Before the Baroque era, musicians did not put dynamic marks in the score. That doesn't mean that there were no louds or softs in music, but simply that performers intuited what they were to do without being told. In the early 17th century, however, composers began to dictate the dynamic level they wished by inserting two very basic terms, piano and forte. Sudden contrasts of dynamics were more prized than gradual crescendos and diminuendos. This practice of shifting the volume of sound suddenly from one level to another is called terrace dynamics. Terrace dynamics went hand in hand with clear contrasts between major and minor keys, as well as with abrupt changes in orchestration. By contrasting distinctly different dynamics, moods, and colors, composers of the Baroque created the one thing prized above all others in Baroque art, drama. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. Key words. Baroque. Doctrine of affections monody basso continuo figured bass terrace dynamics. Early Baroque vocal music 11. Opera. Given the popularity of opera today, and the fact that there had been opera in China and Japan since the 13th century, it is surprising that this genre of music emerged comparatively late in the history of Western European culture. Not until around 1600 did opera appear in Europe, and its native soil was Italy. Opera requires a union of music, drama, scenery, costumes, and often dance. It demands singers who can act or, in some cases, actors who can sing. In opera, all lines are sung, unlike in a Broadway musical, for example, in which the dialogue is spoken and only the emotional high points are sung. The text of an opera is called the libretto, and it is normally written by a poet working in collaboration with the composer. Because all the text must be sung, opera creates a somewhat unnatural art. We don't usually sing to our roommate, "Get out of the bathroom, I need to get to class this morning." The advantage of communication in song, however, lies in the increased potential for expressive intensity, as the flexible sung melody amplifies the nuances of the text. By combining orchestrally accompanied song, scenic design, and dramatic action to make opera, composers of the 17th century created for their day a genre not unlike the multimedia films of today. In opera, however, everything unfolds live on stage and in real time. The term opera means literally work. The word was first employed in the early 17th century in the Italian phrase opera drammatica in musica. Early Baroque opera rejected the Renaissance belief that emotions could best be expressed by a group of singers gathered in a choir. The individual, not the multitude, was now deemed the best vehicle to convey heartfelt personal feelings. From its inception, then, opera placed the solo singer at center stage. Then, as now, three laws ruled the opera house. All parts of the drama are sung, mainly by soloists, the major roles go to the best singers, and these star singers demand and receive huge appearance fees, thus the cost of opera is enormous. Figure 11.1. The major musical centers in northern Italy in the 17th century. The origins of opera can be traced to late 16th century Italy, specifically to progressive musicians and intellectuals in the cities of Florence, Mantua, and Venice. Here, a number of visionary thinkers continued to pursue a goal of late Renaissance humanism, recapture the expressive power of ancient Greek music. Florence in particular was home to several outstanding musical intellectuals, including Vincenzo Galilei, the father of the famous astronomer Galileo Galilei. The elder Galilei and his followers believed that the power of Greek drama owed much to the fact that every line was sung, not spoken. In an attempt to imitate the ancient Greeks, the fathers of Western opera strove to create a theatrical medium in which the drama might be projected through intensified vocal recitations sung to the plainest of accompaniments. While various composers tried their hand at this new genre in the years around 1600, it was not until 1607, with Claudio Monteverdi's Orfeo, that the first great opera emerged. Figure 11.2. Portrait of Claudio Monteverdi by Bernardo Strozzi. Strozzi also painted the singer and composer Barbara Strozzi. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Claudio Monteverdi. Claudio Monteverdi was a musical genius who could manifest his enormous talents equally well in a madrigal, a mass, a motet, or an opera. He was born in the northern Italian town of Cremona in 1567 and moved to the larger city of Mantua about 1590 to serve Duke Vincenzo Gonzaga as a singer and a performer on string instruments. In 1601, Monteverdi was appointed director of music, and in this capacity, he composed two operas for the court, Orfeo and Arianna. But the Duke failed to pay Monteverdi what he had promised. "I have never in my life suffered greater humiliation of the spirit than when I had to go and beg the treasurer for what was mine," said the composer some years later. Thus disenchanted with Mantua, Monteverdi accepted the much-coveted position of Maestro di Cappella at St. Mark's in Venice. Although called to Venice ostensibly to write church music for St. Mark's, Monteverdi continued to compose opera as well. Among his important later works in this genre are The Return of Ulysses and The Coronation of Poppaea. He died in Venice in 1643 after 30 years of faithful service. Figure 11.3. Piazza San Marco painted by Gentile Bellini, c. 1500. St. Mark's was the focal point of all religious and civic activities in Venice. In the 1630s, Venice became home to the first public opera houses. Copyright Scala Ministero per I Beni e lu Attività Culturali Art Resource, New York. Monteverdi's first opera, and the first important opera in the history of Western music, is his Orfeo. Because the aim of early opera was to reproduce elements of ancient Greek drama, it was only natural that the libretto for Orfeo drew on a tale from classical Greek mythology. The leading character is Orfeo, the son of Apollo, the Greek god of the sun and of music. Orfeo, himself a demigod, finds love in the form of the beautiful Eurydice, a mortal. No sooner are they married than she is killed by a poisonous snake and carried off to Hades. Orfeo vows to descend into the underworld to rescue his beloved. This he nearly accomplishes by means of his divine musical powers, for Orfeo can make trees sway, calm savage beasts, and overcome demonic forces with the beauty of his song alone. The theme of Orfeo, then, is the divine power of music. Monteverdi advances the drama in Orfeo mainly through monody, a medium thought to approximate the singing of the ancient Greek theater. The simplest type of monody was recitative. Recitative, from the Italian word recitativo, is musically heightened speech, through which the plot of the opera is communicated to the audience. Generally, recitative is performed without a perceptible meter or beat, you can't tap your foot to it. And because recitative attempts to mirror the natural rhythms of everyday speech, it is often made up of rapidly repeating notes followed by one or two long notes at the ends of phrases, as in the following recitative from Act 2 of Orfeo. Example 11:1. Recitative in Baroque opera is accompanied only by the basso continuo, which consists, as we have seen, of a bass line and accompanying chords. Such sparsely accompanied recitative is called simple recitative. A good example of simple recitative can be heard at the beginning of the vocal excerpt from Act 2 of Orfeo, discussed later in the listening guide. Figure 11:4. The beginning of the second act of Monteverdi's Orfeo, from an early print of the opera. The vocal part of a messenger appears on the odd-numbered staffs above the slower-moving bass line of the basso continuo. Lebrecht Music and Arts. In addition to recitative, Monteverdi made use of a more lyrical type of monody called aria. An aria is more passionate, more expansive, and more tuneful than a recitative. It also tends to have a clear meter and more regular rhythms. If a recitative tells what is happening on stage, an aria conveys what the character feels about those events. Similarly, whereas a recitative advances the plot, an aria usually brings the action to a halt so as to focus a spotlight on the emotional state of the singer. Finally, whereas a recitative often involves a rapid-fire delivery of text, an aria will work through text at a more leisurely pace, words are repeated to heighten their dramatic effect, and important vowels are extended by means of vocal mellesmas, as can be seen, for example, in Orfeo's aria, Pas and Sperto. Example 11:2. An aria is an important, self-contained unit, both textually and musically. Whereas recitative is normally written in blank verse, an aria is usually composed with meter and rhyme. In other words, an aria text is a short, rhyming poem of one or more stanzas. The text of Orfeo's aria, Pas and Sperto, consists of three-line stanzas, each with a rhyme scheme ABA. Moreover, the music for each stanza begins and ends in the same key. Finally, operatic arias are nearly always accompanied not merely by the basso continuo but also by all or part of the orchestra. Monteverdi gives special prominence to the violins, cornetos, and harps in Pas and Sperto to give added weight to the aria, as well as to show how music can charm even the guards of hell. Figure 11:5. Orfeo charms the guardians of Hades with his voice and lyre, a detail from a painting by Nicholas Poussin. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Recitative and aria are the two main styles of singing in Baroque opera, and in opera in general. In addition, there is a third style called arioso, a manner of singing halfway between aria and recitative. It is more declamatory than an aria but has a less rapid-fire delivery than a recitative. The lament that Orfeo sings on learning of the death of Eurydice, Tu esse morta, is a classic example of arioso style. Like all operas, Orfeo begins with a purely instrumental work that serves as a curtain raiser. Such instrumental introductions are usually called overtures, preludes, or sinfonias, but Monteverdi called his musical preamble a toccata. The term toccata refers to an instrumental piece, for keyboard or other instruments, requiring great technical dexterity of the performers. It is, in other words, an instrumental showpiece. Here the trumpet races up and down the scale while many of the lower parts rapidly articulate repeating pitches. Monteverdi instructs that the toccata be sounded 3 times. Brief though it may be, this toccata is sufficiently long to suggest the richness and variety of instrumental sounds available to a composer in the early Baroque period. Its theatrical function, of course, is to call the audience to attention, to signal that the action is about to begin. Although Monteverdi divided his Orfeo into 5 short acts, this 90-minute opera was originally performed at Mantua without intermission. The first dramatic high point occurs midway through Act